Today we will hear a presentation by Jon Plante. Jon is a fourth-year economics PhD student at George Mason, holds an MA in economics from American University and a bachelor's degree in pharmaceutical and healthcare businesses from Massachusetts College. And his research is in public finance, fiscal sociology, and constitutional political economy. His recent publication with Professor Wagner can be found in the Journal of Private Enterprise. And I'm guessing you'll be on the job market next year. Yeah, okay, so be on the lookout for his application then. All righty, so with that, the screen is yours, Jon. Please go ahead and start.
Sure, thank you, Marta. So as Marta had said, my name is Jon Plante. I am a fourth-year economics PhD student at George Mason. Today I'll be presenting a paper that is, for those of you who were here last year for my presentation, is kind of an offshoot of that paper. This one is taking that paper and putting it into a different chunk. And to be honest, I picked this paper to present because I think it's the paper I need the most help on. So I'm hoping to hear a lot of comments from you all. So please feel free to be as critical as you can be. And you probably also saw that in the paper. The writing was probably a little bit shoddy as well, but that's where we have to start sometimes. So let me start with my motivation. Can everyone see this? Because I see a different screen than what you see. Okay, cool. So my motivation for this paper, I was trying to take what Buchanan and Wagner had written in Democracy and Deficit, and then kind of spin my own take on it in an EPE kind of frame, and I'll be repeating this in a few slides. So they have a chapter on money-financed deficits in that book. And something to me in that chapter always stood out, but I wanted to kind of explore more. For those of you who have seen that chapter, there is this table that has the changes in the monetary base, deficits, public debt, and then Fed ownership of public debt. As you can see here, I'm only taking public debt and then the monetary base because it would be way too convoluted to have in one graph. But also, this has the strongest correlation and also the R squared here between these two, public debt and monetary base. So I wanted to show these two first, and I have both the correlation or the R written here, 0.93, and then the R squared 0.87. So pretty strong numbers, but as we know, this always does need a theory. And again, Buchanan and Wagner did provide a theory in their book, and in my eyes, as you probably had seen in my intro and then in my second section of my paper, their argument is really an extension of Adam Smith's, going back to 1776 in the Wealth of Nations. Smith talks about why nations will use money creation as a tool to debase their currency to pay off past deficits and public debt. He has a whole section on it. It's in Smithian terms, so it's a little bit flowery in terms of his prose. But the main point of what Smith was trying to really get at was that there are incentives for politicians to be able to do this because they don't want to be paying back the full cost of what the deficit or public debt is, which essentially is a more aggregate way of looking at a story of rent creation. So looking at the past deficits in public debt to pay those off or to finance those, politicians will be able to use money to to finance those which were provided to the interest groups to whom those deficits and public debt had gone. Again, Buchanan and Wagner take this a little bit further in talking about the Keynesian consensus, and that was their main argument about why the Keynesian theory, after it had gotten into Washington, had provided incentives for both fiscal and monetary policymakers to be able to do this sort of money-financed deficit and public debt, mainly to be able to follow the long-run type of analysis that Keynes followers had presumed that would be able to stimulate the economy in some way, and I use air quotes for that type of stimulation. And I'm probably making a stretch, but the way that I interpret this argument, and I mean, Dr. Wagner is here, so he can tell me what his thoughts are after I'm done. I too see this story as one of rent creation. It's taking the fact that politicians are just responding to the interests of the interest groups to stay in office without really looking at any other alternatives for them to really profit. So here is where I get into where I want to change this story and reframe both, and I single out those two works just because of my own research again, but there are plenty of other ones, but I want to reframe this argument by those two works in a story that's more in line with the EPE framework. And what I mean by that is, if you look at the rent creation story, as I was saying before, it really is one that is looking at politicians as passive actors. So again, they are just responding to some of the demands of interest groups, and for them to stay in office, they are just doing this, and they're not looking at any other types of alternatives for them to stay in office. So they just are creating rents. This is the story that is most in line with some of the offshoots from Tulloch 1967, and also Stigler 1971. But someone within the VPE, or the Virginia Political Economy framework, from McChesney, had a critique on the rent creation story, and had said that, as I was saying before, looking at only rent creation sees politicians as, again, passive. It also does not see that they have other options open to them in order for them to profit. So because, again, I'm trying to reframe the story in an EPE framework that sees politicians as more active and also entangled in the social political economy, I want to use the theory of rent extraction by McChesney to reframe how money-financed deficits and public debts are typically used. So if we do that kind of perspective, we're not only looking, going back to this slide here, we're not only looking at the correlation between money creation and public debt or deficits, but we're also looking at some form of credible threats. This is a huge part of rent extraction. For those who haven't had a chance, I'm sure almost everyone here has had a chance to read the paper by McChesney, or even his later book, 10 Years After. But for those who haven't, or haven't seen it in a long time, rent extraction is essentially when politicians take a portion of the existing rents that belong to private interest groups and are able to take that away and thus profit from being able to do this. And they profit in the sense that because the interest groups want to keep their rents, they will both lobby and pay the politicians some amount equal to, or sometimes even more, to the amount of what their rents are worth. So I hope that makes sense for those who haven't read the paper or haven't read in a long time. There is this exchange that is happening between interest groups and politicians, but it's more so of the value of the rent that the interest groups want to keep, and then the politicians don't actually end up taking those rents away, even though they have issued this credible threat to take it away. All they're doing is trying to, again, extract money from interest groups by having them lobby politicians, and then they end up just basically keeping everything as the status quo. This is a very different story from that of rent creation, because if you have read Stigler from his theory of regulatory capture, the whole essence of that theory is that these credible threats have to be enforced, otherwise there is no rent created. So really, the phenomenon that I'm trying to explain here is these unenforced credible threats. So again, going back to this slide here, what I want to show is that there's a correlation between not only the monetary base having an increase in public debt and deficits, but also unenforced rules that have been put in place by politicians. So here's where I looked at, and I've been looking at this for some time, these rules that have been passed by Congress since, really more so since the mid-1970s, to control deficits and public debt. I didn't put the actual names on this slide, but they are in the paper for each of these bills that have been passed. And all of these bills were not enforced. As we can see now, the deficit is still extremely high. The public debt is still extremely high. And we really haven't seen a surplus in our budget since the early 1990s, and have consistently seen public debt increase. But even before the 90s, these budgetary rules that were being passed with the aim to decrease deficits and public debt have not ever been enforced. So what I want to say is that these rules that have not been enforced are really just explanations, or no, excuse me, they're more instances of politicians trying to issue credible threats to then try to get interest groups to lobby them, and then from there the politicians just don't end up actually enforcing these rules, but they still have to impose costs somehow, and that's where the money creation comes into play. But let me paint you the whole picture rather than starting in the middle. So let me start from the beginning in terms of how I want to explain how all of these phenomena are all related. So let's say, as I say in the paper, that there is some deficit created, and this deficit is created because there is an excess in expenditures over revenue or taxation that is going to one interest group. This deficit is then being funded by public debt because it's then borrowed by the federal government. This, in essence, is an example of a politically created rent because the interest group has a value in excess of the opportunity cost, which would be equal if we had a balanced budget. So in this case, these rents are created. They may or may not stay in the future, depending upon future budgets. So a politician now could continue to have these rents created and still have deficits in the future that are going towards this interest group, or the politician could extract rents that were created from this previously created political rent. So here is where I'm saying that this budgetary rule comes into play. Politicians can issue a rule that will actually decrease how much an interest group is receiving from the budget, which would thus also decrease their rent. They can also increase costs by having more regulation or taxation on an interest group. But the main emphasis is that there's going to be some decrease in the value of the previously created rents to this interest group. From here, we see that these budgetary rules are essentially a credible threat, that these interest groups are thinking that they might have their rents reduced. So then interest groups will predictably lobby the politicians to not have any of these rents decrease, which again include having some regulations, having taxes imposed on them, or most specifically, what we typically see is that there is some decrease in the amount of spending or the appropriations that are being allocated to these interest groups. So this is when we typically see lobbying take place. So at the end of that whole process, if we were seeing rent extraction, we would then see that politicians are not actually enforcing these credible threats. And again, as I said before, they don't enforce these because their main purpose was not to actually do so in the first place. It was really to get and to incentivize the interest groups to lobby the politicians so that they wouldn't actually enforce this. But obviously, interest groups are not stupid. They realize that if they're not having their budgetary rules enforced on them, there has to be some cost that is going to be imposed if they are seeing these threats as credible. And here is where I see money creation coming into play. So money, as we know, money creation also will cause inflation, all else equal, of course, if we have an increase in the money supply. But these costs that are imposed through inflation are not uniform across all people or across all interest groups, since we're talking about interest groups in this case. And this was more so a theory that was started by Richard Cantillon in his essay on political economy. And I also took some of the work by Dr. Wagner in 1977 about how when policymakers are looking at using monetary injections, they do so specifically and have incentives to do so specifically, so they are able to both provide benefits and impose costs on certain interest groups, and they were able to do this because of how they have control over the paths through which money is channeled. And here is where I talk about how politicians have incentives to use money to impose costs rather than other forms, because inflation is a hidden tax. If you look at other forms of imposing costs, they're not as hidden, and this allows politicians to be able to impose costs for a longer period of time without it going noticed, until they need to be able to have their profits reaped from the interest groups lobbying them to take these costs away. So I know that I gave a lot of information there, and I do have a historical example to go over, but I do want to pause to see if anyone has any questions before I continue, or if anyone just wants me to finish with my presentation for the example that I have. Okay, so resuming, everyone's good for me to continue. Okay, cool. So to make everything a bit more concrete, an example that I had found that fit the story, and like, I realize this might be cherry picking, and here's where I would like help from everyone once I am done, and with the theory more generally too. Dr. Wagner, do you want to ask me a question now or after I'm done? Okay, cool. So starting with the same process that I outlined on this slide here, just kind of going in order. In the 1970s, was really the 1960s where we started to see an increase in healthcare expenditures, and that really came from both Medicare and Medicaid being passed, and there was a huge push to come up with a new healthcare system during that time, in the 60s, first under Nixon, then Kennedy, and then Johnson, and that kind of continued forward. But what excuse me, I did that backwards. So it was Nixon in the 70s who really pushed this after Kennedy and Johnson. But during this time from the 70s onward, we see an increase in the expenditures for healthcare. And here is where I'm saying that there are rents that are created for the healthcare industry, where I'm saying that there's an instance of rent extraction comes in from a credible threat, which is a budgetary rule from 1997. It's the Balanced Budget Act of 97, and a huge part of this act, it's actually like one of the biggest parts of the act, was to reduce the reimbursement rates that were provided to hospitals for Medicare. So this, again, is the credible threat that was initiated by this budgetary rule, and it's going towards the interest groups that are in healthcare. After this took place, there is an increase in lobbying from the healthcare industry, more specifically the AHA, the American Hospital Association. There also was some increase, but not as much, from the AMA, the American Medical Association as well. But I differentiated because the act itself is targeting more so to hospitals than it was, broadly speaking, all medical doctors. So we see that the lobbying amount for the AHA, they went from spending 10.66 million in 98 to 22.5 million. So that's more than double in 2011. And they also had increased not just in terms of their aggregates, but also in terms of the placement of where they are in the top lobbying firms, or I guess industries as well. So they went from the ninth biggest spender in 1998 to the third highest in 2011, and I'll explain shortly why I picked that date and year out soon. So because, like I have talked about, money creation and how this is going to impose costs, and I will get to the unenforcement of this Balanced Budget Act shortly. But before I do that, like, I wanted to show the data for CPI, which is one measure of inflation. I looked at the CPI, which is mostly just the urban CPI for both the average and also for the healthcare urban CPI as well, from 1971 all the way until present. And I mean, this graph doesn't show it as well, but you can see that there are periods of time, more specifically in the early 2000s, where there is a decrease in the CPI for healthcare. So if you look right after 2001, you can kind of continue to see that. And here's where I'm saying there are costs imposed because there is this deflationary type of force. And the reason that they're, like, I didn't really explain this, but I have it here on this slide. The reason why I'm talking about deflation as imposing a cost is more because with a lower price comparative or relative to all other prices, you have a lower revenue, which translates to a lower profit, because if you see all other prices staying the same, your costs will, all else equal, stay the same, where all your revenue goes down, so your profit will be lower. So that's something that I need to explain more and look at, but that's why I'm saying that there is this cost being imposed. So the reason why I went over that first was to say that in my theory, I'm saying that there are these costs being imposed, which then also continue to incentivize the AHA to lobby politicians to have both the credible threat removed, but also to have these costs not be imposed on them. So if you look here, after about 2014, we start to see a change in the direction of healthcare costs. It actually goes up quite a bit in 2015 relative to all other prices, which I think is important. Excuse me, wrong slide. Because here, what we see ultimately is that the portion of the Balanced Budget Act was overridden 17 times from 2003 to 2014. So pretty much every year and then some, sometimes even more than once a year, we see that there is no lowering of the reimbursement rate. So this lobbying is plausibly stopping this portion of the Balanced Budget Act from actually being enforced. But what's even more interesting, I think, is that in 2014, we see this actually being overturned. And then going back here to this slide, where we see for the first time they're stopping being this type of decrease in the healthcare CPI. We actually see it increase after 2014. Whether that's related, I have no idea. I just found that kind of interesting to kind of look at in terms of how the story ended up playing out. So that explains my presentation. I look forward to hearing comments and questions. And again, I want everyone to know that I'm open to as much criticism because I know that this needs work, and that's why I'm bringing it here, because there's something here I just am stuck on trying to glean it out, and that's why I wanted to hear from all of you. So thank you.
Thank you, John. Yeah, so let's open it up to questions. Yeah, but I for one, enjoyed your the case study. I think it's quite interesting that they repeated, like it was supposed to be a credible threat, and then it was just ignored for a very long time and not enforced. So it's an interesting puzzle. That's for sure. Yeah, and maybe if you could stop sharing your screen, then we can all have a discussion. Oh, perfect. Yeah. And so we have two hands, so maybe start with Professor Wagner and then Nick.
Okay. I like your presentation and the way that you bring up unenforced legislation. I find, and as I'm thinking about it, I think your topic raises a lot of very challenging and difficult questions, both methodological and substantive, in part because so many things have changed over the last century, both in the US and throughout the Western world anyway. And most of our theoretical formulations are based upon a presumption of a kind of an unchanging base on which we erect our theories, but yet in many respects it's hard to see an unchanging base. For instance, what you call unforced budgetary legislation. That didn't exist before sometime probably in the 1960s. If you, from wherever, 1900, even before then, until the present day within this country, there have been various kinds of budgetary rules, frameworks for making a budget. And you'll find this in all of the textbooks of public finance, public administration, public policy, and all this, where the president proposes a budget, the budget gets farmed out to congressional committees, they approve it, and finally a budget gets enacted. And that was how life proceeded. I'm not aware of any case prior to somewhere maybe late in the Eisenhower years in the late 50s, where a budget wasn't enacted and life proceeded with what they call, at that time anyway, a continuing resolution. Now, in the last 40 years, I don't know if we've had any budgets enacted on time. Pieces of budgets have been, but never the entirety of the budget. And that's certainly a big change in the way of doing business. And which brings to mind questions of how might you account for that kind of transition? How might you account for the growing entanglement between corporate interest groups, political interest groups, and so forth? If you look at the history, for instance, of public choice grew up in a setting where what was dominant in economics into the late 40s, early 50s was a presumption of economic equilibrium combined with some market failures that was the task of welfare economics to correct. And that was just everywhere. And public choice was first to question that kind of presupposition. And I think in any, the public choice questioning was still erected against a background where government business was done largely through appropriation and expenditure, taxation and expenditure. That was where public business was done. The world of private business was done through private law, through private ordering. And so with regulation had, even as into the 1950s, had very little presence within the world of commerce. That's been the growth area of government for the last 3/4 of a century. Now, and now I'm talking about sort of how do you theorize about a phenomena that emerges within a world where the world itself is undergoing some evolutionary development? And what problems does this create? Because you say, well, you have the idea of rent seeking. Well, you could say that grows up naturally in a world where thinkers are trying to challenge the welfare economics point of view, as people like Tulloch were trying to do. And so the idea that corporations would try to get legislators to approve things that they wanted and would finance it, whether it be through campaign contributions, diverting business to law firms in which the politician was a partner. All these things are kind of, might say, a way of saying, hey guys, politics isn't that nice, public-spirited kind of thing that welfare economics wants to say it is. And because what you have with rent seeking is kind of rent seeking then becomes a cousin to bribery in terms of getting what you want, which is, you might say, psychologically a way of trying to lower politics. If you have a plane of moral presupposition, that's the business plane. If welfare economics usually puts politics up here, and the original public choice try to create them equal, rent seeking moves it down. But then when you get to McChesney rent extraction, what you have then is politics as a form of extortion, that you can get paid for not doing. That's the beautiful title of McChesney's Money for Nothing, is you don't have to do anything other than announce that you might do something to get paid for it. And it's a beautiful life. And but what I'm getting at is that I think there's a sense in which your paper seems to carry forward some of the older categories and concepts that separate out various modes, politics and markets, and yet sort of the entanglement kind of motif is that you really don't have that separability anymore. And that's, I think, especially the case because there is no place where you're free from regulation now. Now, if you were to think in terms of, take any of the several thousand separate bureaus and agencies we have in this country now, that every one of those bureaus and agencies has an executive committee, a managerial committee, that what are you going to do as a member of that committee? Are you just going to see yourself as passively enforcing someone's rules? I would say not if you presume that people who aspire to high-level positions in whatever walk of life are people who are above average in energy, imagination, ruthlessness, all of these things. Then if you take it and move it down to the ground level where all action takes place, are you not going to find that even if you're have a position as a director of an office of grazing rights in Montana or some sort of thing like that, are you not going to be engaged in making and issuing rules and regulations in some fashion? Because number one, you need to show that you're doing something, that you're alive. You can't really, this image of a bureaucrat just sitting in an office collecting a paycheck isn't going to fit anyone's desires who occupies that position. It might fit some clerical person who would rather plug in and watch a video than do whatever else you might do, type a letter or something, but it's not going to fit that person. And so what you're wrestling with too is thinking about a form of human population system where we're all engaged in our own various little parts that together generate and this continually evolving mixture of organizations, practices, standards, conventions, and that I think if you go that way, and at the contemporary time, the output perhaps looks kind of ugly, but whether it's improvable, that's a whole different matter. There's, you might say that, one of the questions, and it's there in your paper as well. You may not believe it, John, but it's there in your paper, which is, if you take reasonably seriously the recent polling kind of results stemming around that last election, that 2/3 or 3/4 or so of the population polled on a number of different polls thought this country is going the wrong direction in some fashion. Now, suppose you put that as a scientific proposition. How is that possible? How does that square with usual presumptions about democracy, goodness, and that kind of thing? I think that's, I guess what I'm trying to get at, and it's more of a puzzlement I have, I mean, about not just your paper or the topic, but when I look back over, say a century's historical span, and usually we think of our models as there's a ceteris paribus kind of presumption within all of our models that everything else is unchanged. But it's not unchanged. What we're talking about is a continual development in one fashion or another, and with respect to the entanglement, one of the big things that has happened has been in large measure, the replacement of public ordering and public law with private ordering and private law with public ordering and public law. And so I bet you it'd be an interesting task to say, can you find any place where there is a principled basis on which politics can't get involved? My initial presumption is there is no such thing anymore. Why, I've even heard of news reports, for instance, of such an innocent thing as a couple of sisters outside their house setting up a lemonade or whatever in the summertime cart. My daughters did that once upon a time too. And their mother would bake like some cookies. And this, I think this was in Florida, actually, where I'm living now, but before DeSantis probably, but I would set up, try to make a little bit of money, and a county or city health department shut them down without having a health license and so forth. And that is a very different world in terms of, this raises the question too, of to what extent the world works through the institutional arrangements that we happen to have fabricated at some point in time, or whether what our institutional arrangements are what we have allowed to happen because it fits with our own moral sympathies, perverse or not. And so once upon a time, childhood selling of lemonade in the summer was, well, it was a nice kind of thing to do, and everyone kind of appreciates. There's always probably a Horatio Alger type of story in the background, and things like that, to where now most people, first half of the 20th century wasn't, if you think about it, really highly removed, historically speaking, from a world of largely small shopkeepers. For the early 20th century, you begin to get some of the big industrialists, Carnegies and so forth, Rockefellers. But most people, Main Street, were lots of small shopkeepers. Now, small shopkeepers are pretty much gone. Not totally gone, no, never. But it's the world of the big multinational corporations, which in turn means, my apologies to my deceased friend Henry Manny, I think means that much of the corporate world has been transformed into a form of bureaucracy, and which I think also gets into this entanglement too. So I guess I like your interest in how different monetary arrangements and practices try to fit that into rent extraction and so forth. But yet you have, your narrative covers a historical episode over probably better part of a century. And at the same time, it raises, I think, some interesting questions of how you really analyze that when you don't really have perhaps an unchanging basis, or do you have an unchanging point of view? I don't have a question for you so much as finding that you've triggered something in me in reading your paper and listening to your presentation that says you have marched into some very challenging, difficult territory that I'm sure you can work your way out of satisfactorily. But yet, if you want to be really adventuresome, there are directions you can go as well that would prove to give you a great adventure.
Am I able to respond, Marta, really quick?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. So yeah, thank you for all of that, Dr. Wagner. So the first comment I wanted to quickly make, and this is more for offline. I did like your comments about looking at the change of ordering from a private law and private ordering to a public law and public ordering. And I think that really has, I mean, that's something that like again offline, like we can talk about in respect to taking our paper and like expanding upon it as we talked about, because I mean I actually think I did kind of notice this was in the paper, because one of the ideas I want to think about down the road is how public debt changes our social norms and conventions and everything. So I mean, to your point, even though I don't say it explicitly, that is something in the back of my mind, but I first got to start on the economic story and then kind of build on the more social philosophy stuff after, because that's, that's what kind of helps get publications and everything else. So, but I did want to ask your thoughts, and I don't know if you have a thought, about both your book with Buchanan in 1977 and then your book in 2012, which I know that you said has been your attempt to rewrite Democracy in a Deficit. I think, well, like I guess I have two questions here. Do you think that your story in 77 with Buchanan was more of a story of rent creation, since it's not said, and I don't want to, put words in your mouth, and obviously like I can have my own interpretation, but I was curious. And then also in your solo book, I wouldn't say that yours is a story of rent creation there, but I was just more curious of your thoughts, that if that question makes sense.
Sound? Okay. Maybe we need to unmute.
Do you want me to answer that, Marta?
Yeah, I think so. I think we have enough time, and then we'll go to Nick. Yeah.
Yeah, the difference between the 1977 and 2012, I approached Buchanan, let's see, he died in 2013 or something, 11, somewhere. Anyway, I would have approached him, I suspecting it would have been about 2000 or so, about the idea of maybe would he be interested in bringing out not a new edition of the book, but do what, for instance, Kenneth Arrow and his Social Choice and Individual Values, Bill Baumol and his Welfare Economics and Theory of the State, and there have been a couple other of these books where the publisher reprinted the book along with a big, like 40 or 50 page addendum by the author. and how would we be interested in doing that? Would he be interested in doing that? And he wasn't. And so I decided a few years later that, well, why don't I just bring out what I would like to do now? Because there were places where, well, first of all, Democracy in Deficit was written at a time when public choice was hardly known as a field of study. It only got its name in 1968 at a meeting in Chicago. And so, yeah, that was, rent seeking was very much part of the story. I, on the other hand, was a big fan of rent extraction by that time and so forth. And also, I was much more comfortable with Austrian style ideas about political instability. Buchanan was much more a monetarist kind of fellow and so forth. So, those are the differences. I'm kind of sad we didn't do that joint effort and put together an appendix, although I can see that there are places that might have been a little bit difficult. I mean, any two people after a while can manage to develop points of difference too.
All right. I think with that, let's go to Nicholas and have him ask the question.
Yeah, I mean, I also really enjoyed the paper, John. I thought it was there's a lot, there's something really good there, I think. I just have two questions, and one of which may be dumb, so feel free to, ignore it or what have you. But it's a question of when money is being created, it's kind of flowing throughout the price system. Doesn't it seem kind of hard if a politician wants to target a cost to a particular interest group to do so through money creation, because you're essentially trying to game how the increase in people's cash balances are going to be treated by people based upon their demand to hold them. And it may be that their underlying preferences are, they really like the product or what have you of the particular industry that is attempting to be targeted. So it may actually have the opposite effect of it may actually promote their relative price for their end use above their rent, and actually, again, like contribute to the creation of temporary inflationary profits for that industry. And then secondly, I wondered if you would ever considered this as kind of like a part of a political business cycle wherein that you have the run up to an election where we get these sort of disbursements to constituent groups, various industries, something like that, to secure votes. And then over the course of the cycle, then maybe we get this sort of extractive process taking place. I just wanted to pick your brain on that. Yeah, those are my two.
Cool. So both great questions. So no, and I also believe that no question is ever dumb. So, so also, if I'm being honest, I think the first one is a very good question. So I don't have an exact answer for you in terms of that, because that, like what you had laid out, is definitely possible. More of what I am saying is that one of the possibilities is that there is an incentive for politicians with the hope that there will be these deflationary forces that take place. And in this case, I mean, like, assuming that that's what they had wanted to do, it did work. But as you had noted, it could have gone in the other direction and actually caused some kind of inflation, some kind of temporary inflation. To be more specific on your point about their it being hard to do, I I don't necessarily think that it's hard to do for politicians with the types, not really the types, but more so of the tools that are available to monetary policymakers. And I'm only looking just at money creation, but there's also reserve requirements and different regional banks can have different reserve requirements, which can also impact how costs are imposed, which come from different inflation or deflationary forces and all of that. So I left like a lot of those details out to be more abstract. So it's good that you as a reader were able to kind of pick up on the more detailed things that could possibly take place. So I think as I'm talking this out, I need to be more explicit about this being just one possibility. So thank you for pointing that out. In terms of your second question with political business cycles, it's funny that well, I guess it's a coincidence that you mentioned that because if I'm being not honest, but like one of the papers that I had took to kind of create this theory other than McChesney was Wagner's 1977 paper. I always forget the full title. It's like economic consequences. It's like political manipulation, economic consequences. I forget the full title, but the whole point of this paper is that politicians use monetary forces to be able to profit at some points during the whole electoral cycle. So in a way, this paper really was built in addition to the political business cycle literature and kind of like a tangential way of looking at it. That's how I've always interpreted the paper. I don't know if Dr. Wagner has any, disagreements with that, but he does obviously critique that whole literature at other points of his career. So that's why I'm not sure how he would frame that. So to be more specific with your question, though, no, I did not see that relation, but I think that is an offshoot of this paper. So a really good observation. Just I don't know if in this paper that would be the focus, of course, because there's already so much going on. And, one of the things I struggle with is keeping things kind of linear and not adding more arguments within one. So hopefully those comments that I just gave you answered all your questions and gave some thoughts there. Thanks.
All right. Great discussion. Do we have any other questions for John? Okay, I think looks like we're done with the. Oh, actually, yes. Professor Wagner, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, something Nicholas raised I wanted to continue on, but before that, let me just say, it came up here on this 1977 paper in Keklos on political business cycles. That paper was really written as an objection to the entire literature that had developed at that time, which took a Keynesian kind of macro model and just had a budgetary expansion and contraction built into it, and argued instead I brought in a kind of a coalitional politics kind of model. And the simple kind of story would be if you had a parliamentary system with 9 districts, that if there were 3 districts that you were quite confident your party was going to win regardless, and 3 that you had no chance of winning, you wouldn't put anything into either of those districts and would put it all into the 3 that were up for grabs. And so it was very much fit within a rent-seeking kind of model, and also within a bribery, which is a rent-seeking model kind of model. But that's not what I wanted to take up, thinking about what Nicholas asked about money, and which is, you ever thought, what does the Federal Reserve really do? We ask that question. I mean, the Federal Reserve has what, around 1,000 economists or so distributed across, was it 9, 10, or 11? I forget the number of districts. Now, if you look in terms of basic monetary theory kinds of ideas, the Federal Reserve, the central bank, is there to promote stability in the supply of money. That doesn't take very many people at all to do that. And if you go back to an earlier point I made about looking at executives in governmental agencies, anyone who has an executive position is going to have a menu of activities that are open to them, which is going to involve them in opportunities to sell themselves to other people, to show what they have. And this is as true, I would submit, for a central bank as it is for a Department of Fish and Wildlife or any kind of governmental agency. If you want to, and I think you must, theorize from life on the ground building up, rather than impose some kind of welfare function above and go downwards. And so if you approach it in that way, then what does a position as an executive in a central bank bring to you that you wouldn't have had if you didn't have that position? And I suspect, my own suspicion is, if you pose that kind of question and were to dig into it a bit, you would open up into some new kinds of conceptual insights into this money extraction central bank line of questions. I don't have anything more to say about that, but I think Larry White once put out a paper maybe 20 years ago, it might have been. Everything to me is 20 years ago now. That's a problem. But he put out a paper that almost all economists who deal with monetary issues, monetary theory, policy, have connections with the Federal Reserve. Many of them summer interns, summer research positions, grants, conferences. And so does that mean that the Federal Reserve is buying the good opinion of economists? Well, I'll leave that for you to conclude. You could, that is a fact, but it's part of the on-the-ground ways in which I think you really should think about bureaucracies rather than from up in the sky going down. That was, I think, really the brilliance of Gordon Tullock's old Politics of Bureaucracy, was that was very much written from the point of view of someone on the ground. In his case, it was as a official in an embassy in the State Department as China was going communist. But I think it's, so far as I know, the only person who has raised any questions like that about the central bank is Professor White. But I think there's some really interesting potential there. Maybe I might even get to it one of these years. I don't know. I keep trying.
No, would you like to respond? Yeah, no? All right. Okay. Sorry, I'm switching my screens here. All righty. So I think that brings us to the conclusion of today's conversation. Thank you, John, for a great presentation. Very promising project. Keep us posted. I'll be happy to share it with the network once you're bringing it to completion. And if you saw my email, if you're interested in these topics and would like to participate in a session like on entangled political economy, John Murphy is organizing a session for the Southerns. I think Michaela has something in the works as well. We will share more about that in the email, but basically keep us in mind if you want to connect at the Southerns and participate in sessions there. And next month we will have Erwin Decker here, so I will share his paper in the coming weeks. Thank you all for coming, and I will see you in February. Thank you.
Thank you.